Hi, I'm Simon van Norden. Affiliations there. I'd like to thank Renee, Sarah, and everyone else for putting this together. It's wonderful to be here and see how many close friends and admirers Mardi really had. I was thinking back of my own memories of Mardi, and they reflect so many of the things that some other people have already mentioned. I think my favorite memory, I visited UTAS in 2010, 2011 on Mardi's kind invitation. And my favorite memory was of Mardi as a warm and generous host. She invited me back to her house for a family dinner one particular evening during our stay. And we'd agreed that she was going to cook dinner and I was responsible for making dessert. And I was going through a massive baking phase at the time. So I had all kinds of cake recipes with me. And then, of course, Mardi told me that her son had a terrible gluten intolerance. He had some serious medical problems. And, you know, you're a baker who's never baked anything gluten-free in your life, and you're responsible for providing dessert. But it turned out very well because I'd gotten into making tarte tatin. And because nobody doesn't like apples and caramel if you just smother it with enough butter, right? And Mardi knew where she could source a nice gluten-free pie crust. So we spent an afternoon in her kitchen, slicing apples, making dinner, doing a bit of baking, and then enjoying it with her husband and her kids, and sitting around the table afterwards while we played her family's favorite board games, while her children beat me savagely at them, like a drum, or as the saying goes, like a rented mule. But they were very gracious about my attempt at gluten-free tarte tatin. And I think that's just emblematic of the openness and the warmth that Mardi showed so many people, and her ability to just seamlessly integrate her family life and her professional life. And I guess I'll always remember that. Anyhow, without any further ado, I'd like to present another great member of Mardi's community, Denise Osborn. Denise, please take it away.
Thank you, Simon.
Your slide is the next one.
Okay, thank you. I'd also like to thank the organisers. I think it's a fantastic initiative of Tara and Graziana to think about having an event of this type, and I think those of us who knew Mardi all appreciate it very much to be here and to celebrate her many contributions, not just academic contributions, as many people have said, but her contributions went well beyond the academic sphere. I was sitting there earlier trying to think when I first met Mardi. I think it was shortly before she went to Cambridge. She went to Cambridge in 2005. So I think it was probably early in 2005 on the assumption she went in the autumn. And I was visiting ANU at the invitation of Heather Anderson. And Mardi was at ANU at the time. And it was Heather who said, "You must meet Mardi Dungey." I'd never heard of Mardi, to be quite honest at that point. "You must meet Mardi Dungey. You'll get on really well." Well, that was extremely true. So we met at ANU, and then when she came to Cambridge, of course, and I was in Manchester, it was easier, and we interchanged visits often. And then when she came back to Hobart, to UTAS, I would come to UTAS about once a year, and Mardi would be in the UK about once a year. So we interacted over a long period, I guess relatively frequently. So I've got a couple of photos that you've seen going around, doing the rounds, but I just thought I'd start by saying a little bit about those photographs and what I think they represent in terms of Mardi and her wider contributions, if you like. So this photograph was taken when I was visiting UTAS, and the setting is actually the garden of the Cascades Brewery in Hobart. And when I was visiting, Mardi would often say, "Oh, let's go somewhere for lunch." And it was a nice day, so she said, "Let's go for lunch." And she'd think of somewhere that was appropriate to that day, and this was a lovely day, so we said, "Oh, let's go to the Cascades Brewery. They have an outside area where we can sit, a cafe, etc." And you might think her hair looks slightly strange in that photograph, but the colour is quite interesting. My recollection is she'd been experimenting for fun with her daughter May about hair colouring, and things didn't go quite right with it. So until the colouring, she had for a little while, she had this very strange pinkish sort of hair colour. But this just shows that she was interacting with her family as well, of course. And the next, oops, I've gone too far. The next one was actually my first visit to UTAS in 2008. When, as Mardi often did when she had a visitor coming, she would often organise a workshop around that person. She did it, I think, probably with many of the people who are here in the audience. And so when my first visit in December, it was summer. Remember that, early summer, but it was summer in Australia. It was December 2008, and she organised a workshop. And in fact, you have here Farshid Vahid and Heather Anderson, who you probably don't quite realise in there. She'd invited them to the workshop, and it was also their first visits to Tasmania. Neither, although they were at that time at Monash, which is a short hop from Melbourne to Hobart, they'd never been to Tasmania before. So Mardi invited them to the workshop, and Mardi decided we'd all go on a bushwalk on the weekend. I think it was just after the workshop. Unfortunately, the weather was not really that conducive to going on the bushwalk. We all did anyway, so Mardi's, Jack and May, her children, Ross, her husband, and actually here is her mum, Mari, who also came, and was Mari who provided us all with jackets. We didn't have jackets. You come to Australia in the summer, you don't expect to need a jacket. So Mari's mum made sure we all had jackets to go on this bushwalk. Now we had a great time. We all got wet. We were so cold, but we had a fantastic time. So we had to go and find a cafe with some hot drinks to warm up afterwards. But just indicative of how Mardi would, I think, organise things around people who were coming, make them feel very welcome. And as others have said, her family was part of the wider sphere that she were involved in all her activities. And finally, photograph including Jing, who's here and talking later, and Wei Ying and Mardi. This was, again, something Mardi organised around Richard Smith this time. Richard was visiting, I think he was visiting Melbourne at the time. So Mardi invited him to come down to Hobart, and there was a dinner. But I think more generally, it illustrates Mardi interacting with junior colleagues. She worked, and Jing might say a little bit more later, she was very encouraging, very supportive. They happened to be two females. I don't think it was particularly, she was in general very supportive of women, but not just women. It wasn't exclusive. She was supportive of younger researchers. And I just think they're a very relaxed setting. Mardi's clearly very relaxed. I think it's just very indicative that she's sitting there between two of her younger colleagues in the department at a dinner in honour of someone who's very well known and visiting the department. I have many other memories of Mardi, but I'll move on to the paper, in that the paper is also a jointly authored paper, unfortunately our last jointly authored paper. It also has a history. It's a long gestation period in this paper. because on one occasion I went to Hobart, we were going to work on the paper, and Mardi had a long-term, quite severe back problems. And she was told she should have surgery to help these back problems. And my visit had been arranged for quite a long period, and it just so happened that the date they could do the surgery was the day after I was due to arrive in Hobart. So we were going to work on this paper, we'd had the ideas, we'd started, but of course she had major surgery on her back the day after I arrived, we couldn't change things, etc. So that got delayed. Then Mardi was coming to the UK, again, motivated to finish this paper, to work on this paper, and I had a serious heart problem at the time, which is now fine. But so the day Mardi flew into Heathrow, literally, the day Mardi flew into Heathrow, I had the problem emerged, and I had to email Mardi, when she arrived in Heathrow, she got an email from me, sorry, I'm in hospital. And it turned out I was in hospital for next month. So eventually, in 2018, when Mardi was visiting Cambridge as part of her final tour, we got together and we said we're going to finish this paper. And we were really pleased with ourselves. We patted ourselves on the back because we finished the analysis and finished very soon afterwards a written version of the paper. But yeah, it's fine. We were congratulating ourselves that we got through, finished the paper without either of us having a major health problem, because we joked about it. I remember Mardi joking about this I was going on ambulance between hospitals and Mardi came with me, and joking with the ambulance, people in the ambulance, about the fate of her coming and talking about this paper. Anyway, so, thank you, Mardi. The paper relates particularly to a paper we'd already published in the Journal of Applied Econometrics, which was interactions between the US and Euro area economies. And we've been talking, even when we were doing that earlier paper, about what would you do with the interactions between the US and China, because they weren't two developed economies over the sort of sample period. You're looking at how would you handle the problem of one economy developing in relation to the US as a technology leader. So we've been talking about this for a long time without really without getting down to doing anything. I don't think I have to motivate the fact that the relationship is an important one, and it is quite staggering. This is the log per capita GDP over our sample period, which is 79 to 2016. Here's the US, and here's China. Okay. So China's, you can see, approaching. Still a long way because these are log values. Still a long way because in 2016 the per capita GDP of China was still only about 13% of that of the US. So it's still, if you looked at the raw ratio of the two per capita GDPs, it was still a long way away from the US. But the trajectory is of course a fascinating one. And there's a literature that's been quite prominent. Does China's development affect the US? And if it does affect the US, is it good or not good for the US? And that's not been clear. There's been a debate between various authors in that context. And it's a hard question to answer because if you look at particular industries, some industries lose, other industries win, etc., in terms of China taking employment from some sectors, but then the increased trade with China benefits other sectors of the US economy. So it's not an easy question to look at, and we're not pretending it's an easy question to look at. It is very difficult. And there's not a stable historical relationship, because China was essentially a closed economy until the end of the 1970s. And it's been increasingly integrated, abstracting from current trade war and all sorts of issues about the coronavirus and all of these recent things. But it has been, at least in the trajectory, has been increasingly integrated over the time period we're looking at. So it's important, we thought, to capture both the long-run relationship, the catching up, if you like, and the short-run interactions between the two economies. So our approach is to use a long-run convergence, using the sort of literature on development to motivate a long-run relationship, plus short-run, data-driven bilateral interactions. It's the way we handle them. So to give you a preview of our results, because then we know where we're heading, and we should have time, but we'll see. So this is the multiplier effects to a US shock. So we look at this one first. Probably makes more sense to look at this one first. The US shock on China, first 1979, when China first starts to open up, and there's some relationship. These are estimated values. There's some in the paper, there's some confidence interval work as well. 1979, even after, what are we up, 50 years, it's the multiplier effect, the effect of 1% shock to the US has a 0.8% on China, bigger in 2003, the trajectory, 2016, 2025, and then ultimately at convergence that I'll talk about in 2129 is just a sort of arbitrary value, 150 years after. And it's going up here because this time we're imagining it rolling forward with convergence increasing as time goes on. So the effect, it keeps on increasing because there's an increasing effect through the long run relationship. So you don't have, this is going to keep on increasing if you pushed it further out until you eventually got up to the same value as here, and I'll talk more about the model, obviously. This is what we puzzled over for quite a long time, is actually, and it's one of these things, or when the penny drops and you realise, well, that was obvious, but it took us a while for the penny to drop. This is the US on US, and according to our results, the US also gains. So the multiplier effect of a US shock through the model back on itself is increasing over time. So again, 79, 2003, 2016, 2025 and 2129. It's not nearly so dramatic, of course, but it's according to this model, and it's relatively simple in the sense of what we're doing, and we had ideas about developing it, but the US is also gaining according to this analysis of ours. Okay, so what should I talk about in the next 20 minutes or so? The framework, the data, and then some results and final conclusions. So our econometric framework, our distinctive feature of this model is using the literature of development to talk about, so the model in which an economy is the output converging towards a steady state value with a beta convergence rate. So the basic equation that lies behind a lot of papers in development is this one, where a developing economy is converging towards some steady state value. So that was the basic inspiration of our long run relationship. But we modified it to say, well, China, the YT is China per capita GDP, the YT star now is US per capita GDP. So China developing not towards some fixed, constant, steady state, but converging towards a US value. And the US value, of course, also changing over time with technology shocks. So that's the US per capita GDP. We thought, well, how do we represent the fact that even had China remained a closed economy, how do we represent the fact that China would have developed to some extent? So the way we've tried to capture that is we've hypothesized an internal growth rate that China would have had it remained a closed economy. So it's a non-stochastic, thinking of it as a closed planned economy that grow at some, if you like, relatively slow rate without external influences. That's the YTI, into what we call the internal per capita GDP. And that's non-stochastic. Okay, so that's the frame. That's our long-run equation. That's the key feature we've got. Made stochastic, but that's the key feature we've got. I won't talk about this a lot. I think it'd be pretty obvious to many people if you have this sort of relationship. It's a time-varying relationship, inherently time varying because of the convergence rate, China converging towards the US GDP. Things like linear co-integration that some people have tried to apply to these sort of contexts isn't going to work. The linear co-integration is not time varying. There are variations on co-integration that are similar to what we use. But we are hypothesizing ultimate convergence to a common level. And in one paper, Phillips and Sewell refer to that as being possibly called asymptotic co-integration. It's perhaps not a very nice terminology. We might, if we thought hard, think about something else, because convergence is itself an asymptotic phenomenon. So, but anyway, we've stuck to that term that they you could call it asymptotic co-integration. So it means that in the long, what we're saying asymptotically, they would converge to a linear co-integrating relationship as t goes to infinity in this sort of setup. So the empirical long-run model is precisely this one, that China's the US level, then this term which asymptotically disappears between the internal growth rate and the internal level of per capita GDP in the US, and what we just call gap as the residual from that. And that's the gap process is a zero mean stationary or transitory process. Okay. So just to emphasise that again, that before convergence starts, if we write it as the China per capita GDP being weighted of the US per capita GDP, and what it would be its own internal rate had it not converged or had it remained a closed economy, the weight on the US before it opens up is 0. So when it's a completely closed economy, US has no influence. But while it's converging, we have the weight depending on the convergence. And ultimately we have this 2000, what did I say, 2129, I think we're hypothetically using the China per capita GDP, if it continued, would be the US GDP plus a stationary transitory component, whereas at the beginning it's just this internal rate. So we're transiting, in our model, we're transiting from a trend stationary process to one that would ultimately be a linear co-integration with the US, with a unit coefficient in the US. Then short-run dynamics are fairly conventional. No, I think they're totally conventional, not just fairly conventional. China dynamic model, we're assuming the US is a technology leader. Okay, in the long run, that may not be a very sensible assumption, but that's, for this purpose, for this period, it seems a reasonable, I won't say perfect, but a reasonable sort of assumption. So the US is a technology leader, and the contemporaneous relationship we're hypothesizing goes from US growth to China growth. Then we have some dynamics from both, and then China adjusting to this gap, this time-varying term, long-run relationship. That's essentially a conventional. If the long run was a conventional linear co-integrating relationship, that would be a perfectly conventional model, and precisely the one we used in the paper in the Journal of Applied Econometrics for the US and the Euro area. We find we're dealing with annual data. The sample period is not that long. We find we don't need lags beyond 1, which is not too surprising empirically for annual data. The short-run model has constant coefficients over time. You could imagine having time-varying short-run interactions as well. We tried a little bit of experimental with that, but it wasn't changing very much. And it just becomes very difficult to deal with if you're allowed too much time variation. So the only time variation is going to come from the long run in the results I'll show you. We have in the short run for the US is reacting to China growth, past growth, as well as its own past growth. Okay, so as I say, the contemporaneous causality we're assuming is running purely, it's an assumption, but is running purely from the US to China. And the US doesn't react to the gap, disequilibrium. So it's assumed to be the technology leader, as paper with Hashem with Adrian Pagan, show that in a conventional model that would ensure the permanent shocks are only from the US, which is what we're in that framework. And anyway, when you include the gap in the US equation, it's not significant. Anyway, empirically. The shocks between the US and China, of course, short-run equations, of course, are correlated because of the contemporaneous causality assumption. Importantly, and this was something that took us a while to penny to drop, that if the US, sorry, this is US equation, if the China coefficient is 0, then of course the US is exogenous to China. So if that phi 2 star coefficient is very important, if phi 2 star was 0, there's no way in which China growth could influence the US. And it does play a crucial role in our model. Okay, as I've said, the only element of time variation is due to this convergence. I perhaps won't talk about this. This is just a way of setting up and trying to see it again. But it says again, and we think about the setup of the model. If China had no influence on the US, this phi 2 star was 0, you could see the US equation here would be constant. But interestingly, perhaps, and just worth saying, if that phi 2 star is not 0, then if you look at the equation representation here of the US growth, then China growth, the gap enters here indirectly in the setup, and so does you get a second lag on US growth. So you get time variation, importantly, without going into details, you get time variation in the US equation in the model when you work it all through because of this feedback from China to the US, which we originally thought it was innocuous, but then it just seemed a logical thing to do, but far from innocuous. So the data, that's annual per capita real GDP in US 2010 prices from the World Development Indicators database, purely standard data to use in this sort of context. We have to think about when China became open to external influences. That's a little bit arbitrary, not totally arbitrary, but a little bit arbitrary. We choose as 1979 as a period after which China is open to influences. That's the sort of period, the end of the Cultural Revolution, death of Mao, etc. So a lot of things happened in China around that period. Changing it a bit doesn't affect results in any substantial way. So you might think, well, maybe it was a year or two later or whatever. It's not crucial what's going on choosing 1979 as the base period. Before that, we say it's just a closed economy China, and after it begins, the convergence process begins. 79 to 2016 was when we last did the analysis. 2016 was the last year of data available. You can talk about the accuracy of China data. I think everybody has some doubts about the accuracy of China data. We've been reassured by work others have done, including Tara, about that. We think, well, what else do? Do you just throw it out and say, we don't trust the Chinese data, so we're not going to use it? You can't really do that. I think we have to work with it as the best we can, as at least representing the general trend, if not the absolute detail year to year. We need to have this China internal, what it would be if it would remain a closed economy. We actually take the actual value of the China per capita GDP in 1979, and we assume a growth rate. The results we focus on we assume an internal growth rate of 1% per capita. Again, it's not crucial. We looked at 0, no, and we looked at 2%, and the pattern doesn't change dramatically. So again, if you think it would have been low, and it seems a reasonable assumption, if you think it would have been low, then these are the sorts of values one might think about. Okay, so some results. When we estimate by nonlinear least squares our long-run equation, this straightforward nonlinear least squares estimation, we get a convergence rate of 2%, which we thought, that looks low, that doesn't seem to look quite right, that we would anticipate a higher convergence rate than 2%, despite the fact we're talking about convergence from what we assume would have been its own internal growth rate of 1%. not just, but we were suspicious, and we found when we looked at, it's always good to look at your results. When you look at the residuals, if you like, the estimates of the gap from that constant, they're clearly not stationary. They're just, I don't think I've included a picture because I wasn't sure how much time I'd end up having. But they're clearly not stationary. And they seem to imply evidence for structural break around 2001. So we then started to think about structural breaks and what happened if the convergence rate changed. So if we assume a convergence rate of 2001, to end of 2001 is a period that has some economic interpretation, well, strong economic interpretation in the fact that China joined the World Trade Organization in December 2001. And a number of the commentaries on China's growth in this century have been about the importance of being a member of the World Trade Organization. There's other things going on around this sort of period, including the so-called productivity slowdown in the US, which I think, when Mardi, I think I forgot to say this, but Mardi actually gave an earlier version of this paper here at GWU. Sorry, I overlooked saying that, I meant to. In her spring tour, in her tour in 2018. And I think there was one of the things that was mentioned then was, well, why 2001? Perhaps it would have been things going on in the US as well, and why 2001? Why not 2005 or 2008 or whatever? We did some digging around after that, and some structural breaks analysis. If you take the estimated gap series and treat that and look at the structural break in that series, it suggests it could be between 2001 and 2005. And in fact, the smallest residual sum of squares comes at the end of 2001. So while it could be, if you like, one of these things that could move around a bit, but if you look at the breaks, estimating a break date as the smallest residual sum of squares, you'd go for the end of 2001, which is reassuring, but it was good to check that. So the impulse responses I show will include that convergence break. So we have that implies until between 79 and 2001, was converging at a rate of 1.74%, and then from 2002 onwards, it's 3.21%. It nearly doubles that convergence rate. So here's the impulse responses I showed earlier. So the impulse responses to a US source shock. So that becomes quite important here. So 2003 now we have the increase, from 2003 we have the increase in the convergence rate. It also complicates earlier things, because once you have a break in the rate of convergence, an earlier shock as it works through, so a shock, let's say even in 1979, in 1979, there's a break in convergence later on, so it affects the end of this, because that's feeding back each time as the China GDP growth is adjusting to the gap, and it's the new gap it's adjusting to all the time. So that even filters through to these estimates. Importantly, and again, we didn't quite realise the importance of this initially, was that the feedback from China to US, we estimate we admit this is a very simple framework. There's nothing, the only data we're using is per capita GDP. So there's obvious dimensions in which the model could be extended to other variables in a richer environment. We thought we'd start simple. It is positive. It's at 0.163. It's not huge. It's on the borderline of significance at the 5% level. But equally, if you do more analysis about possible break dates in that short-run relationship, it changes that and put in dummies, because there's all sorts of things going on in this period. There's the GFC, there's things going on in China. If you put in some dummies, it doesn't change this coefficient much. It does change its significance, but it doesn't change the value of the coefficient very much. So we've just stuck with a simple OLS estimate over the whole period. But the crucial thing, according to this framework, is the US also benefits from the catch-up. So the US responses aren't constant over time, because it took a while just to sort of, as I say, one thing that took a while for the penny to drop. If China is adjusting to the US, but the US is responding positively to China's growth, as it is here, then the US, then as the China responses increase because of convergence, China's benefiting in terms of a growth rate. So that will feed back to the US, and the US will itself benefit from that. So it became logical when we thought about it, but something that was a surprise initially. There's also impulse responses of China shocks. So again, they don't vary very much. They do have a little bit of time variation. They're transitory, they disappear, and just vary a little bit over time. So China on the US and China on China. There is some time variation, but not very substantial there. And importantly, they are transitory as the setup implies. There's more. I should also say that the paper will appear in the special issue of the Economic Record that's being put together, the journal put together in honour of Mardi. It's been accepted for that special issue. That was something Mardi suggested I should do with it. So I, of course, recognised her wishes and submitted it to that. It's now accepted, and I think an early view version is now just appeared on the website. And there's some more results in there than I talked about today. But, and here's a table of the responses. So after 10 years, cumulative multiplier responses for a 1% US shock. So the US shocks, again, after 10 years, they're actually not great, but they are non-trivial. Multiplier going from 1.4 to 1.7 after 10 years. And of course, the China response has been showing huge increases. Well, we do hope the framework will be useful for a framework of, I think, of people who have struggled in the long run in this framework where you're using some of the ideas or the basic of the long convergence together with like a quite conventional time series analysis of the short run, hopefully would be useful for other studies, and there's obvious developments of this model that could be done. Which we have a mic.
I'm waiting for the microphone.
Yeah.
Although maybe I shouldn't.
Oh, it's coming. It's coming.
Oh. Okay, thank you. Jerry Dwyer, Clemson University. So you're assuming that China's going to converge to the same level as the U.S. If you look across the world, there's not a lot of evidence to that, actually.
Yeah,
And so how much difference would it make if you pick arbitrarily Germany?
I don't think the basic story would change. I admit, I agree that the idea of the long-run convergence may well not apply in the long run, but at least it's a framework that allows you to and over the sort of sample period we're looking at, it seems a reasonable way, because we're only looking at the first part. The convergence is nowhere near finished at the end of our sample period. We're then, in effect, projecting that into the future, I agree, but I think as China develops, you'd also want to think a bit about how the framework changes. Why should all the shocks, technology shocks, come from the US as China continues to develop? So that we assume that the technology shocks come from the US all the way through, if you like, through to convergence. That doesn't seem realistic if you think of taking it further down the convergence path. So I think there's a lot of issues if you tried to push it further. I don't think changing from the US to Germany would make a substantive difference as sort of results.
Yeah, but you think the interaction will change?
Yeah, the interaction would change. Yeah.
Thank you.
A very, very nice combination of using this very intractable convergence problem. I spent a lot of time on this as well. And also with the time series. I think, however, the interpretation of this one has to be careful because obviously, as you know, other countries in the world existed. And also the common technological factors. So in a way, what you're really picking up, you may be picking up, but better more careful, that maybe you're dealing with an observable technological factor which both China and US are benefiting. So therefore, the question doesn't follow necessarily from your analysis that if China remained close, US wouldn't have been growing. In other words, so the counterfactual argument would be, what if China remained close and Nixon didn't go to China? That could be a question, which I think Americans may be facing now. Maybe that wasn't a good idea from their point of view. So that's I don't think that doesn't answer it here, and I know how difficult it is to answer. But I like the framework. But I think when I developed the GVAR, I had the same problem. We had this conversation with you, Mardi.
Indeed.
And I think what maybe you want to do, you may want to have a 3-country model at least, in a sense that, the rest of the world sort of situation and has an observer component, and then to see to what extent the loading of these countries differ or it's an observed component. So basically, it's sharing of technology that it could be possible to say that China start jacking up the loading on this unobserved factor. So it's not, so in a way, it gets manifested the way you have done it, but I think the interpretation and the analysis could be different and it still would be compatible with no convergence.
Yeah.
Because your argument is not really they actually converge. I mean, because it's such far away.
No, and
so therefore, you don't really need that, in my view. You could put the intercept there to allow per capita income of the two countries to always be a gap between them. So, but that's not the issue. The issue is not whether you converge to the same number, whether you will get closer at some rate.
No, I think I agree with everything you say, and I think perhaps some of the language of the paper may also not quite reflect that, because we are treating as a world in which there's just the US and China, which of course they are the two biggest economies in the world, but it still doesn't represent the world. So no, I would accept that. Thank you.
Robert Schreiber with International Investor. You mentioned that in 2001 there was a structural break. I think, if my memory serves me right, George W. Bush, having just taken office, I think 2000, gave preferential trade treatment, or I forget the status, to China in that year as well. I can't remember if it fell in 2000 or 2001, but that's what really opened the gates for U.S.-China trade.
That could well be, and again, that could change the date slightly. And having read around some of these issues about China joining the WTA in the end of 2001, the support for of the US for that was very important, I think, in that decision. So that reinforces the importance of that, and whether it was therefore slightly earlier is, I think it's possible, but it's not going to substantially.
In addition to WTO,
yeah,
it gave it an added surge of trade.
Right. Yeah. Yes, that's true.
So I was wondering, so in your application, the convergence takes a long time, but I guess I was wondering, with your methodology, could you allow it for, because you're essentially assuming weak exogeneity of the US, since it's not reacting contemporaneously to basically the co-integrating relationship. Can you allow for, with your methodology, could you allow for basically converging into a place where US is no longer weakly exogenous? In that sense?
I think that would change the methodology. I'd have to think about that.
It should be okay.
Should be okay?
Yeah.
Hashim says it should be okay.
Great. Well, maybe on that note, we should take a break for lunch. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So lunch is back in the lounge.